Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene.
On October 4th, 2021, at 3 o'clock 20 minutes in the morning, the driver of a refrigerated truck traveling on unlit Highway 97 south of Lapine, Oregon, slammed on the brakes. In the headlights, a woman stood in the median. She was completely barefoot, dressed in a dirty tarpaulin overalls, and weighed barely more than 90 pounds. Her hands bore deep chemical burns, and her eyes were completely blank. A computer scan of her fingerprints in the intensive care unit of a local hospital produced an impossible result. The woman was 31-year-old Jeanette Cole. She and her 25-year-old friend Sarah Moore disappeared without a trace on August 14, 2016, at 9:30 in the morning, during a routine hike along the Green Lakes Trail. For 5 years, investigators believed they were dead, victims of wild animals or a fatal accident in the isolated wilds of the Deschutes National Forest. But the horrifying truth was that all this time, Jeanette had been in a living hell, hidden just a few dozen miles from civilization. Now she has broken out of the darkness to tell us who brutally murdered her friend and what horrors really lurk behind the high fences of the Oregon wilderness. The summer of 2016 was abnormally dry and exhaustingly hot in Oregon. The National Weather Service set new temperature records almost every week, and forest rangers warned tourists about the critically high level of fire danger. The dry needles crunched loudly underfoot, and the air was literally buzzing with heat, creating a heavy, stifling atmosphere even in the deep shade of the century-old trees. On June 25, 2016, 26-year-old Jeanette Cole and her 25-year-old friend Sarah Moore decided to spend the weekend away from the hot concrete of Portland. They had been best friends since their college days together and regularly went on expeditions to the wilds of the West Coast, considering themselves fully prepared for the vagaries of nature. According to official financial statements that detectives later seized, at 7:15 in the morning, the girls paid with a bank card for 2 coffees and a light breakfast at a roadside cafe, then drove south in a dark blue SUV. Their main goal was the Deschutes National Forest, a vast, moody wilderness area well known for its rugged, rocky terrain and extremely dense coniferous forests. The girls had carefully planned a 2-day hike along the Green Lakes Trail, a picturesque but rather remote hiking route. At about 10 o'clock in the morning, outdoor surveillance cameras at a gas station in Bend captured their brief stop. This blurry black and white footage would later become the last documented proof that both women were alive. The footage clearly shows Jeanette, dressed in a light hiking jacket and sturdy boots, methodically filling the car with fuel. At the same time, Sarah spread out a large paper topographic map of the area on the hood of the SUV, concentrating on plotting the best route. A 52-year-old gas station attendant on duty that Saturday morning told investigators during a formal interrogation that he had personally spoken to the tourists. According to the witness's words, which were recorded in detail in the police report, the girls were interested in the condition of the dirt roads leading directly to the foot of the mountain ranges. They asked if it was safe to go there after the recent light rainfall in that area of the forest. The worker particularly noted that the 2 women were completely calm, smiling a lot, and showing no signs of anxiety or haste, even the slightest. After a short conversation, they got into the car and drove south, toward the endless green sea. It was about 40 miles of winding, gravel-covered forest road from the gas station to the start of their chosen trail. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the same day, June 25th, a cell tower 12 miles from the forest's edge picked up the last short signal from Jeanette's cell phone. After that fateful moment, both devices disappeared from the network forever. For such deep areas, The lack of stable coverage was quite normal, so in the early days, none of her close friends and family suspected a truly dire scenario. According to the route plan left by their family, the friends were supposed to return home no later than the evening of Sunday, June 26th. When it was late at night, and their cell phones kept automatically forwarding all incoming calls to voicemail, their relatives began to worry. At 9 o'clock in the morning on Monday, June 27th, the head of the construction company where Sarah worked called her mother, worried that she had not shown up at her workplace without warning. This was the final trigger. At 11:30 in the morning, the Deschutes County Sheriff's Office received an official report of the disappearance of two young women. The police immediately deployed a strict protocol for an emergency search for missing persons in the wild. At 1 hour and 45 minutes in the afternoon, a ranger patrol crew discovered Jeanette's dark blue SUV in an official gravel parking lot right at the start of the Green Lakes Trail. The vehicle was perfectly level, the windows were up, and the doors were securely locked from the inside. The investigation team quickly obtained a warrant to force the vehicle to open. A careful examination by forensic experts yielded nothing. A pair of replacement city sneakers, an empty plastic bottle, and crumpled receipts from the morning's gas station were neatly lying on the back seat. There were no signs of a desperate struggle, no fingerprints on the steering wheel, and no drops of blood on the upholstery. That same evening, more than 40 trained volunteers, professional Forest Service trackers, and 3 dog handlers joined the rescue operation. At dawn on Tuesday morning, 2 police helicopters equipped with military thermal imagers were immediately launched. Over the next 2 weeks, the search teams combed through dense thickets and dangerous canyons. They methodically covered an area of more than 50 square miles around the spot where the SUV was parked. The specially trained dogs quickly picked up the scent at the car door, led it confidently for about 2 miles along the main trail, and then suddenly stopped and began to whine in confusion. The scent would abruptly stop, finally getting lost among the fresh tracks of dozens of other ordinary hikers. Homicide investigators thoroughly checked the bank accounts and all possible social media profiles of the missing persons. No activity or financial transactions were found since 2 in the afternoon of June 25th. According to the testimony of their concerned relatives, they were quite experienced hikers and physically could not have gotten lost on a well-marked route, having compasses and maps with them. However, the eerie silence of the forest did not give the investigators any clues. The search teams found absolutely nothing. Not a lost heavy backpack, not a torn shoe, not even the smallest piece of cloth on sharp branches. The dark blue SUV in the empty parking lot remained the only mute witness to their fatal arrival. The large-scale search had finally reached a dead end, and the dense darkness of the Oregon thickets seemed to have won its next undeniable victory. Experienced detectives tiredly threw up their hands, not even realizing that their men were combing the forest in the wrong place. They were looking for accident victims, completely unaware that the real, horrific answers to all their questions were hidden far beyond the safe tourist trails, in a place that had never been on official topographic maps and from which no one had ever returned alive. By the beginning of the fall of 2021, the voluminous file with materials on the disappearance of Jeanette Cole and Sarah Moore had finally turned into another hopeless hang-up. The case was gathering dust in the deep archives of the Deschutes County Sheriff's Office, officially closed until new, substantial evidence or the discovery of the bodies. The work of search teams had long since ceased, and hopes of finding even fragments of equipment had completely faded. That fall, the weather in the region deteriorated sharply. On October 14th, heavy storm fronts moved in over the forests, and a prolonged, cold downpour began, quickly eroding dirt roads and turning old asphalt into a dangerous, slippery slope. It was this stormy night that broke the 5-year wall of absolute, dead silence. At 2:45 in the morning, a 50-year-old driver of an oversized commercial truck was driving along the empty and unlit Cascade Lakes National Highway. According to his official testimony, detailed in a 4 o'clock in the morning police patrol report, visibility on the road was critically low due to a dense wall of rain and thick fog. Suddenly, in the bright light of the halogen headlights, a human silhouette appeared on the narrow, blurred roadside. The driver instinctively slammed on the brakes. The multi-ton truck, sliding on the wet pavement, stopped just a few yards from the man, who did not even try to move off the road. The man grabbed an emergency flashlight and ran out into the cold downpour. In front of him stood a young woman whose appearance caused real horror. She was completely barefoot, her feet turned into a continuous bloody wound from walking for a long time on sharp gravel and asphalt. Her clothes consisted of shapeless, dirty, torn and soaking wet rags that did not protect her from the cold at all. The woman was critically exhausted, and her thin arms were thickly covered with deep, ugly scars from old wounds and specific chemical burns. The driver immediately locked the cab door, put the woman in the passenger seat, turned on the heat, and at 2:52 called 911. He clearly informed the dispatcher of the coordinates and the fact that the pedestrian was in critical condition. At 3:30 in the morning, an ambulance delivered the unknown to the closed intensive care unit of the Bend Central Hospital. The doctor on duty immediately began resuscitation measures, noting in the medical record an extreme degree of dehydration, vitamin deficiency, and severe hypothermia. Her body temperature dropped below normal, and her weight barely reached 85 pounds, which was a life-threatening indicator for an adult of her age. The woman was in a state of deep, dissociative shock. Her eyes did not focus on the faces of the medical staff, and she did not respond to any verbal stimuli or questions. According to the standard protocol for identifying unknown persons who arrived without documents, at 4:15 in the morning, a forensic scientist took her fingerprints using an electronic scanner and uploaded them to the National Criminal Database. The automated system's response came as a bolt from the blue. The computer confirmed a 100% match between the papillary patterns. On a hospital bed, under an intravenous drip, was Sarah Moore, a girl who had been presumed dead for 5 years by investigators and her family in the wilds of Oregon. In parallel to these shocking events, another gruesome scene was unfolding 20 miles away from the hospital room that same morning. At 9:15 in the morning, a team of private surveyors was performing routine topographic ground measurements to expand a logging zone in the area of the long-abandoned Pamis Quarry. It was a harsh, isolated area, with extremely steep slopes and sharp volcanic rocks, rarely visited by even the most avid hunters and experienced rangers. One of the company's specialists, while setting up massive measuring equipment at the edge of a deep, rocky crevasse, noticed an unnatural dark spot among the gray stones. Climbing down the slippery slope a few feet, he came across a half-rotten hiking backpack. The dense, synthetic fabric was badly torn, covered with a thick layer of old dirt, mold, and moss, which was an indisputable indication that the thing had been there for many harsh seasons in the snow and rain. The surveyors acted strictly according to the instructions. They did not touch the suspicious find with their bare hands, recorded the exact coordinates on their devices, and contacted the local police at 9:40. A patrolling crew of rangers arrived at the specified location at 10:15. The officers immediately fenced off a wide perimeter with yellow police tape and called in a team of forensic experts from the county. The backpack was removed as carefully as possible, placed in a sealed plastic container, and taken to a special laboratory for analysis. Under bright fluorescent lights, investigators slowly opened the rusty, jammed zippers. Among the moisture-damaged clothes and the remains of basic camping equipment, they found a massive silver pendant tarnished by time and a secure plastic wallet. Inside the wallet was a well-preserved state driver's license. The photo and the printed name on the official document left investigators in no doubt that the found items belonged to Jeanette Cole. The return of Sarah from the dead and the simultaneous discovery of her missing friend's personal belongings on the same day, after 5 years of absolute silence, could not have been a mere coincidence. This eerie coincidence restarted the stalled investigation with unprecedented vigor and scale. The case of the missing tourists instantly regained its status as the highest priority in the entire state. Dozens of the best detectives were immediately recalled from vacation. All of them clearly understood that while Sarah Moore was fighting for her life in the intensive care unit under the supervision of police guards, the forest had finally begun to give up its material evidence. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the district's chief investigator was already nervously pacing the corridor outside the heavy ICU doors, waiting for doctors' permission to begin interrogation. He knew that the emaciated woman was the only key to unraveling Jeanette's whereabouts. But when Sarah eventually regained consciousness and uttered her first, barely audible phrases, recorded on the officer's digital recorder, the detectives realized with horror that the truth about her survival would be far more frightening than any previously voiced theory about lost tourists. Dear viewers, before we continue our immersion in this dark story, I have a small request for you. Please subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and like us. These simple actions are extremely important because that's how the algorithms of the YouTube platform work. Your activity will help promote the video, and this vital investigation will be able to reach many more people. Thank you for your support. And now we return to the events in Oregon. Sarah Moore was held in a locked intensive care unit under constant armed guard by state police. 5 long years of absolute isolation and unknown horror had left an extremely heavy mark on her. According to official medical reports, in addition to critical physical exhaustion, the patient suffered from profound dissociative amnesia. This defense mechanism of a shattered psyche completely blocked her ability to communicate verbally. The woman categorically refused to speak, painfully reacting to every slightest sound in the ward with a sharp, panicked clenching under the hospital blanket. The Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately assigned its best crisis psychologists to the case. They worked with Sarah literally around the clock, even despite the enormous pressure from the press and society. The specialists acted with the utmost delicacy, clearly realizing that any sudden movement or intonation could provoke a nervous breakdown and permanently close access to her memory. They had to carefully extract the information without causing new psychological trauma. Time was running out inexorably, and Jeanette's exact location remained a dark mystery. The real breakthrough in the case came only on the 7th day of intensive care. During a quiet evening session, Sarah suddenly reached out and picked up the yellow notebook and ballpoint pen that the psychologist had deliberately left in plain sight every time. Her fingers visibly trembled as she began to write the first letters. According to the investigators' reports, these notes were not a coherent and logical story at all. Rather, they were chaotic, fragmentary phrases imbued with concentrated fear. Every now and then she would write the eerie phrase, "underground crypt," on the paper, and repeatedly mention an unknown person she called the Watcher. The letters were pressed so hard into the paper as if the woman was putting all her pain into them. The investigative team and forensic analysts literally studied each sheet of paper under a magnifying glass, written in the rescued woman's uneven handwriting. They were desperately looking for at least some geographical reference. Eventually, among the dozens of disturbing drawings of gloomy corridors, Sarah remembered the specific name of the place where she said they were held for the first few years after the abduction, and which became a ray of hope for the entire search. This eerie place was called Oak Creek Manor. Experienced detectives immediately turned to the local county archives and carefully pulled up old land records. The database check yielded impressive and completely unexpected results. It turned out that a large forest plot of that name did exist. It was located in an extremely remote part of the Massif, far beyond the popular Sparks Lake hiking trail. Formerly, this rocky land had been considered completely unsuitable for any construction for many decades due to the constant risk of massive landslides. However, an in-depth analysis of the financial statements revealed a much bleaker picture. It turned out that this abandoned territory had been quietly bought by an unknown shell company back in the early noughties. The registration documents quickly led to a complex network of offshore accounts, reliably hiding the names of the real owners. The isolated plot of over 40 acres provided the perfect legal cover for a secret facility that would never be visited by a patrolling inspector under normal circumstances. After receiving the exact coordinates from the satellite, the task force did not waste a minute. Dozens of heavily armed police special forces officers piled into armored vehicles, fully prepared to storm the enemy territory. They drove along dirt roads with a single goal: to find the missing Jeanette and put an end to this horrific 5-year darkness. However, when the heavy convoys broke through the thicket and stopped in front of the tall, rusty gate of the old mansion, instead of the answers they had been waiting for, they found something that made even the most hardened professionals freeze in icy, primal terror. The Oregon State Police Special Operations Task Force began moving into the isolated wooded area called Oak Creek Manor 2 hours before dawn. The black armored tactical vans drove along narrow dirt roads with their headlights off, navigating with night vision devices. Each soldier understood the extremely high stakes of this operation. They were not just going to detain a suspect. They were going to pull a man out of an absolute hell that had lasted more than 5 years. The thick morning fog densely enveloped the trunks of centuries-old pine trees, creating the perfect cover for the police convoy's absolutely silent approach. As the special forces covered the last mile and deployed in combat formation around the exact coordinates determined by the satellite, they were struck by a chilling realization. What looked like the usual remnants of dilapidated farm sheds on the satellite images was actually an ingeniously designed camouflage. When the soldiers got close to the old, mossy wooden structures, they noticed that the rotten boards were just a decorative facade. Under the thick layer of fallen leaves and fake flooring was a massive, reinforced concrete slab. In the very center of this slab was an extremely heavy industrial-strength steel hatch, hermetically sealed from the inside with several reliable electronic latches. It was a real entrance to an underground bunker, safely hidden from the world at a depth of several tens of feet. Using silent hydraulic tools, the police bomb squad picked the outer locks and carefully lifted the heavy manhole cover. Stale, cold air, with the smell of chemical disinfectants, instantly wafted out of the dark chasm. The assault team, illuminating their way with bright tactical flashlights, began a slow descent down the narrow concrete stairs. What they saw at the bottom amazed even the most experienced detectives. The underground complex was a real, high-tech, eerily sterile prison. The walls of the long underground corridor were completely covered with a thick layer of special acoustic foam. This frightening detail meant only one thing. The oppressive bunker was designed so that no one on the surface of the forest could ever hear a single human cry for help. Walking down the corridor, the armed men stopped in front of 2 massive metal doors that were equipped with modern locks with digital access panels. After forcibly breaking them open, 2 separate cramped cells opened up to the police. In the center of each room were heavy iron cages, firmly welded from thick construction rebar. The bunker was completely empty. Neither the mysterious overseer nor the captive Jeanette were there anymore. However, the physical traces of the girl's long stay were scattered literally everywhere. Gray clothes worn to tears, worn plastic slippers, deep scratches on metal bars, and dark marks on the cold concrete floor. The true scale of the psychological horror was revealed to the investigators a little later, when they examined in detail a small adjacent room that served as the control room for the kidnapper. There, on a metal table next to the surveillance camera monitors, was a neatly folded stack of black leather diaries. These were the methodical notes of the man whom Sarah called the Watcher. The experts began to study these texts on the spot. The entries showed unequivocally that this was never a simple kidnapping for ransom. An unknown predator conducted extremely cruel, carefully planned psychological experiments on his victims. His main goal was to completely destroy the girls' personalities. He created a completely artificial reality for the prisoners. He completely deprived them of access to natural light. The warden could leave the bright light on for several days in a row, or plunge the cells into pitch darkness for hundreds of hours. He forced victims to kneel for hours on end and memorize huge lists of invented rules, severely punishing each forgotten word with prolonged sleep deprivation. However, the diary pages revealed something else. Jeanette stubbornly and desperately resisted this madness. The warden recorded with undisguised irritation that she refused to follow his orders to the letter, whispered her own name to keep her sanity, and methodically shook the iron bars of her cell. She refused to break. And that's what made him change his plans. The last entry in the diary consisted of only one eerie line that made the detective shudder. The warden calmly stated that the walls of the bunker could no longer contain Jeanette, and so it was time to begin the final phase, to transfer her to a place where no living soul had ever returned from. The in-depth analysis of the evidence recovered from the underground bunker at the gated Oak Creek Manor has been a real challenge for the Federal Bureau of Investigation's leading crime lab. Examining the sterile room, which served as the warden's control room and medical office, investigators found dozens of vials of specific drugs. There were powerful neuroleptics, tranquilizers, and muscle relaxants, which are usually available only in closed, specialized institutions. Nearby, on metal surgical trays, were perfectly cleaned instruments. However, the greatest professional value for experienced profilers was not the chemistry, but the specifics of the black diaries found. The records were kept with absolutely manic precision. The unknown criminal carefully recorded the dosage of drugs in milligrams, noted the heart rate of his captives, described in detail the reaction of their pupils to artificial light, and changes in blood pressure after applying various brutal methods of psychological pressure. The Behavioral Analysis Department quickly compiled a detailed psychological profile of the suspect. The use of complex medical terminology, perfect knowledge of the anatomy of the nervous system, and the ability to maintain the basic life of critically exhausted victims for years undoubtedly indicated that the criminal had a higher medical education. In addition, the professional tactics of disguising the bunker and the use of classic army methods of sleep deprivation silently testified to the serious military experience of this person. The decisive breakthrough in this extremely difficult case was provided by modern biological technologies. During a thorough examination of the internal filters of the bunker's ventilation system, forensic scientists found several microscopic particles of human epidermis. The DNA profile extracted from them was immediately uploaded to the Unified National Criminal Database. At the same time, graphology experts completed an in-depth analysis of the handwriting from the pages of the seized diaries. Both completely independent lines of investigation unexpectedly converged on one single name: Arthur Crawford. Arthur Crawford's official dossier, which eventually landed on the desk of the chief investigator of the district, resembled a chilling chronicle of the development of absolute evil. A former highly skilled military surgeon, he was dishonorably discharged from the United States military many years ago. The official reason for his court-martial was numerous documented cases of extreme cruelty to prisoners and even his own patients. During interviews, his former colleagues described him as a brilliant but completely devoid of human empathy sociopath. He was a true master of psychological manipulation, able to quickly inspire confidence and blend in with any crowd without a trace. After his release, Crawford seemed to dissolve into a thick fog, unnoticed, settling in remote areas of Oregon. Meanwhile, in the closed ward of the intensive care unit, Sarah's condition began to improve, slowly but surely. With round-the-clock support and the careful work of crisis psychologists, her profound amnesia began to recede. The investigators decided to take a key step. They carefully placed several old photographs of different men on a sterile hospital table in front of her. The woman looked at the black and white pictures for a long time. Suddenly, her breathing became rapid and ragged, and tears welled up in her eyes. Her trembling finger unmistakably pointed to Arthur Crawford's face. According to the official interrogation report, Sarah covered her face with her hands and whispered that she would never be able to forget his cold, dead gaze. It was from Sarah's words that the detectives finally learned the details of how this long-lasting nightmare began. It turned out that Crawford had been methodically tracking them from the gravel parking lot at the beginning of the official Green Lakes Trail. He skillfully pretended to be an ordinary lone hiker, quietly keeping a safe distance of a few dozen yards behind. The victim testified that he acted according to a perfectly rehearsed algorithm. He was heavily armed, acted completely silently, and in extreme cold blood. His movements were clear and confident, as if he were in an operating room. The analysts finally realized that they were facing not just a kidnapper, but a typical ideological predator. His real goal was to prove the perverse theory that any, even the strongest human will, can be completely trampled by years of isolation and metered pain. Jeanette desperately resisted this systemic madness, constantly thwarting his plans, and thus became his main personal challenge. Realizing exactly what kind of monster they were dealing with, police units launched a large-scale manhunt, but the last phrase in his diary about a new place for Jeanette suddenly took on an absolutely fatal meaning when detectives discovered the exact coordinates of his second, much more terrible hideout. The Federal Bureau of Investigation Task Force and the Oregon State Police were faced with a critical, life-saving task. A large-scale manhunt for former military Dr. Arthur Crawford had already been launched in all neighboring counties, but for experienced detectives, his capture was momentarily put on the back burner. The main goal was to find Jeanette as soon as possible. Time was running out inexorably, and the only person who could point them in the right direction was the rescued Sarah Moore. The girl's condition gradually stabilized in the ward of the Bend Hospital, thanks to constant medical supervision. But every memory of the underground bunker invariably caused her severe panic attacks. It took several long, grueling therapy sessions for crisis psychologists to bring her to the most painful topic as carefully as possible. According to the official audio recording of the interrogation, dated October 16, 2021, Sarah was finally able to tell in detail about the turning point of their imprisonment, which forever changed the course of this criminal investigation. It all happened in the deep winter of 2019. According to a witness, despite years of unbearable torture, severe sensory deprivation, and constant exposure to strong tranquilizers, Jeanette somehow managed to retain a powerful inner core. She categorically refused to psychologically surrender and methodically prepared a desperate rescue plan. For several long months, using a sharp piece of rusty construction rebar she found, Jeanette secretly loosened the massive metal hinges on the door of her iron cage. She worked with extreme caution, acting only during the hours when a heavy diesel generator was loudly running on the surface, its vibrating hum completely masking the suspicious grinding of metal from the warden's ears. The culmination of this unprecedented resistance came during a routine inspection. When Crawford descended into the concrete bunker to administer the prisoners a routine dose of muscle relaxants and conduct his trademark brutal psychological tests, Jeanette acted with lightning speed. She sharply kicked down the physically weakened cell door and attacked the former military doctor with incredible fury, sharpened rebar in hand. As Sarah later tearfully testified to investigators, Jeanette did not try to save herself, realizing her meager chances against her husband. Her only goal was to win a few precious seconds. She desperately shouted to her friend to run to the open armored door and climb the concrete stairs to the forest floor as fast as she could. But this heroic attempt failed quickly and brutally. The physical advantage was completely unequal. Arthur Crawford, with his many years of experience in Army hand-to-hand combat, quickly recovered from the unexpected attack. He blocked the exhausted girl's weak punch with extreme coolness and professionalism, knocked the improvised weapon out of her hands, and ruthlessly suppressed the riot. Sarah, securely locked in her cell, could only watch in mute horror as the warden methodically beat her friend until she was completely unconscious. After this bloody incident, Crawford showed no human emotion or anger. He merely stated in a dry, purely medical tone a phrase that was forever etched in Sarah's memory. He loudly declared that this particular patient was no longer healable in their shared ward. That same night, they had a terrible parting of the ways. Testimony recorded by investigators indicates that Crawford tied Jeanette's hands and feet very tightly with thick plastic ties, taped her mouth shut with duct tape, and dragged her motionless body down a cold, dark corridor. Sarah could hear his heavy footsteps echoing on the stairs, the massive steel hatch slamming shut forever with a dull metallic clang. And a few minutes later, the sound of the powerful engine of his diesel pickup truck quickly disappearing into the night. Since that fateful night in 2019, Sarah has remained in the underground bunker, all alone, doomed to listen only to her own breathing. Her own incredible rescue became possible only in the fall of 2021, and it was the direct result of a single logistical error by a flawless monster. On that stormy evening, Crawford came down to the dungeon extremely nervous and in a great hurry. Leaving the complex, he habitually closed the top-heavy hatch, but in his panic, he forgot to turn the main external electronic lock. Realizing that the system did not emit the usual locking sound, Sarah gathered every last bit of her physical strength, broke the flimsy internal latch, and managed to lift the lid, escaping into the life-saving downpour. This shocking testimony finally gave police analysts a full understanding of the terrible situation. Jeanette was not killed in the bunker. She was transported to some other, specially prepared, isolated location for the most difficult targets. Financial experts immediately began to unravel the complex web of Crawford's fictitious bank accounts. Around 2 in the morning, they discovered deeply hidden legal documents for the purchase of a long-abandoned mine high in the county's mountains. The SWAT teams were immediately put on alert. But an extremely difficult, leaden question hung in the tense air of the offices. What exactly had the ruthless sadist been doing with his recalcitrant victim in absolute isolation for the past 2 years? And was there anyone left alive in that dark mine? The Federal Bureau of Investigation has officially put the name of former military Dr. Arthur Crawford on the national list of the 10 most wanted criminals in the United States. All patrol crews, border checkpoints, and international airports have received his detailed description and the latest photographs. However, the real, decisive breakthrough in this complex case was not provided by street patrols, but by the painstaking and methodical work of financial analysts in the office. On October 18, 2021, at about 11 o'clock in the morning, a team of professional investigators who had been working around the clock to unravel the fugitive's complex network of fake bank accounts and offshore companies came across another highly suspicious transaction. According to official tax documents that had miraculously survived in the archives, several years ago the same fictitious corporation that owned the underground bunker had purchased another property. It was an old, long-abandoned farm called Redwood Century, located in the deep Oregon wilderness a few dozen miles from the small town of Lapine. The 80-acre site was located in a completely isolated area, surrounded on all sides by almost impenetrable swamps and extremely dense coniferous forest. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, aerial reconnaissance using unmanned aerial vehicles equipped with military thermal imagers confirmed the police's worst fears. The farm complex was not abandoned at all. The analysts clearly recorded the presence of the latest video surveillance cameras around the outer perimeter, and most importantly, a high double fence with barbed wire, which, according to remote measurement devices, was constantly under deadly high voltage. Realizing that any delay could cost the life of the missing Jeanette, the operations leadership made a tough decision to immediately storm the facility at night. On October 19, 2021, at 2:45 in the morning, an elite FBI Special Operations Task Force with massive support from the Oregon State Police Regional Special Operations Unit encircled Redwood Century Farm in a tight, impenetrable ring. The operation was planned with millisecond precision. At 3 o'clock sharp, police technicians remotely cut the main power cables, completely de-energizing the entire facility and securely disconnecting the high-voltage fence. The assault was lightning fast and absolutely ruthless to any obstacles in the way. Heavy armored tactical vehicles simultaneously broke through the massive gate from 3 different directions, sending up columns of smoke. Dozens of soldiers in heavy ballistic gear, using stun grenades to disorient them, stormed into the main 2-story farmhouse. Arthur Crawford was caught completely off guard. According to the official reports of the assault team commander, the former military doctor did not even try to get to his large arsenal of automatic weapons, which forensic experts later found stacked in the next room. The soldiers kicked in the massive oak door of the main office just as Crawford was kneeling in front of a large stone fireplace. He was methodically and calmly throwing computer hard drives, flash drives, and thick folders of paper documents into the raging flames, trying to destroy all evidence. He was instantly thrown to the wooden floor and handcuffed tightly in thick steel handcuffs. However, it was not the speed of his arrest that impressed the experienced operatives the most, but the monster's reaction to the arrest. All witnesses to the incident unanimously noted in their official reports that Crawford showed no signs of natural fear, panic, or aggression. When he was roughly lifted to his feet and pushed hard against the wall for a search, his face was frozen with the absolutely cold, dead, and chilling expression of complete calm that is so deeply remembered by his victims. His pulse didn't even seem to be accelerated by adrenaline. At 3:20 in the morning, in the courtyard of the seized farm, in the cold, pouring rain and the bright light of police tactical spotlights, the county's chief detective attempted an emergency initial interview. Jeanette's life was hanging in the balance, and the investigators asked the captured criminal directly, without any prelude, where he was hiding his second prisoner. But Arthur Crawford only slowly raised his gaze to the angry officers, smiled slightly at the corners of his lips, and made no sound. He chose the tactic of absolute, mocking silence. Meanwhile, dozens of other officers with trained dogs began methodically combing every square foot of the vast farm. They opened up old wooden barns, picked rusty locks on underground grain storage facilities, and carefully inspected abandoned silos. The air around them was buzzing with nervous tension and the loud barking of the service sheepdogs. At 4:15 in the morning, one of the experienced dog handlers, who was inspecting the farthest corner of the site near an old, dilapidated tractor garage, suddenly gave an emergency signal on his radio. His dog was desperately tearing at a heavy metal door, partially hidden under a thick layer of rotten hay and dirt. The detectives rushed in with crowbars and hydraulic shears, their hearts beating in a frantic rhythm as a barely audible, faint, rhythmic thud suddenly came from under the thick metal. Time was playing against the investigators. Every second that had passed since Arthur Crawford's detention in the main house could have been fatal, and fatal for Jeanette Cole. At 4:15 in the morning, the search operation on the vast grounds of Redwood Village Farm reached its highest point. Dozens of police SWAT officers and experienced dog handlers with trained working dogs methodically combed every square inch of the isolated area, yard by yard. The air was saturated with the pungent odor of wet earth, rotting pine needles, and nervous tension. At about 4:00 in the morning, one of the most experienced dog handlers was drawn to an old, half-buried massive industrial water tank behind the ruins of a sagging tractor garage on the edge of the site. From the outside, this structure looked like a long-abandoned, useless piece of rusty metal, densely overgrown with moss, mold, and tall weeds. However, the service sheepdog began to furiously dig through the damp earth at the very base of the metal tank, barking loudly and not responding to the guide's harsh commands to calm down. Upon closer, more thorough examination, the officers were horrified to find that a thick layer of sticky mud cleverly concealed a massive steel gate valve, locked with a modern padlock. According to Crawford's architectural sketches, which were later seized, this old tank had been converted into a completely sealed, soundproofed room that the ruthless maniac cynically called safe haven in his journals. It took the state police rescue team about 15 minutes of continuous, hard work with powerful hydraulic cutters to finally break through the thick metal of the padlock. When the heavy manhole cover was swung back with a loud screech, icy, stale air with a distinct, sickening smell of chemicals and deep dampness immediately rushed out of the dark chasm. Illuminating their way with powerful tactical flashlights, the armed detectives began a slow, strenuous descent down a narrow and slippery vertical ladder. Inside the deep tank, there was absolute, physically oppressive darkness and dead, unnatural silence. The space was completely devoid of even the slightest source of natural light. The bright beams of police flashlights slid uneasily across the bare metal walls, which were heavily covered with cold condensation, until they caught a tiny, shrunken human figure in the farthest corner. It was Jeanette Cole. She was lying on a dirty, thin mattress, curled up tightly in a fetal position, trying to keep herself warm. Her physical condition teetered on the very thin edge of complete exhaustion. Her skin had turned a frightening, almost transparent pale gray, and she weighed barely 70 pounds, according to subsequent official medical reports from the intensive care unit. When the commander of the assault team dropped to one knee and called her name in a voice trembling with emotion, there was an unbearably long, heavy pause in the bunker. Then, very slowly, with an incredible effort of will, the girl raised her head. Her eyes, long since unaccustomed to any light, were tightly closed in pain, but she nodded weakly, barely noticeably. She was alive. 2 endless years of absolute isolation in this cramped metal crypt could not completely break her spirit. The process of evacuation to the surface was carried out with the utmost medical care so as not to provoke a heart attack. At 5:10 in the morning, a special emergency helicopter with red crosses on board took off into the cold, rainy Oregon sky, heading toward St. Charles Medical Center in Bend. It was there, in a locked, heavily guarded intensive care unit, that an event would take place a few days later that the hospital staff present described in their journals as the greatest symbol of human resilience. The reunion of Jeanette and Sarah was held under the strict, second-by-second supervision of crisis psychologists from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Witnesses to this emotional meeting recalled that there were no loud screams or sobs in the sterile room. The 2 women, mercilessly exhausted by years of monstrous torture, simply held each other's mangled hands in silence, and their tears fell quietly on the snow-white hospital sheets. They survived in inhumane conditions in which it seemed physically and psychologically absolutely impossible to survive. Their incredible inner connection, forged in the absolute darkness of the dungeon, became the very lifeline that kept their sanity at the very edge of the black abyss. The trial of Arthur Crawford began in the spring of 2022. The sessions were held in closed session due to the unprecedented brutality of the case file. Throughout the months-long hearings, the former military doctor maintained a chilling, completely unperturbed calm. He was only methodically writing something down in his leather notebook, and never once looked his surviving victims in the eye. The state prosecutors presented the jury with thousands of pages of recovered handwritten diaries, which described in all the frightening medical detail his monstrous, perverted experiments on the human psyche. In his emotional closing argument, the prosecutor called Crawford the true architect of absolute evil, a man who cynically turned the remote, picturesque forests of Oregon into his personal laboratory of unbearable torture. The jury's verdict was swift and unanimous. A federal judge sentenced Arthur Crawford to several consecutive life sentences in a maximum security federal prison without the slightest chance of parole. He was sent to serve his sentence in solitary confinement in a concrete cell, where he himself was forever subjected to the same total isolation to which he had so coldly and methodically subjected innocent people. The Redwood Sanctuary Farm and the deep underground bunker were completely razed to the ground by heavy bulldozers under a special court order. The 2 best friends, whose once carefree life was forever, irrevocably divided into a bright before and a gloomy after the fateful summer of 2016, began their incredibly long, painful journey to recovery. They settled together in a small, sunlit house on a rocky coastline, as far away from dense, dark forests and any confined spaces as possible. Their difficult process of psychological rehabilitation would take many more years, but they were now completely safe. Relying on each other, just as they had done in the darkest and most hopeless times in the concrete crypt, Jeanette and Sarah proved to all of humanity an irrefutable truth. Even the most vicious, calculated evil cannot completely extinguish the inner light of the human soul.